Retirement isn't a reward, it's a trap. Society hands you a gold watch and expects you to fade away quietly. Most men surrender to this narrative and waste their final decades in purposeless leisure, watching their relevance, relationships, and mental acuity disintegrate. The psychological consequences are severe, meaning evaporates. Identity collapses, but old age becomes a prison only if you accept the key. Understanding precisely how to transform this final chapter requires a fundamental mindset shift that few men make. The responsibility to reject this trap falls entirely on you. Stay with me, because the first principle will challenge everything you believe about purpose after 65. The conventional wisdom about retirement is not just wrong, it's dangerously wrong. Society tells you that purpose ends with your career, that meaningful contribution has a strict expiration date, that your utility to others somehow diminishes with your employment status. This is a catastrophic lie that's destroying men in their later years. Let me tell you about my friend Robert, high-powered executive for 30 years, respected leader, identity completely fused with his career. Retirement hit him like a death sentence. Within 6 months, his vitality evaporated. His calendar, once filled with consequential meetings, became a wasteland of trivial time fillers. His physical health deteriorated, but his psychological health collapsed entirely. Not because his body was failing, but because his sense of purpose had vanished. He was breathing but no longer truly living. This isn't just about staying busy, it's about the fundamental psychological need for meaning that persists throughout your entire lifespan. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, discovered that those who maintained a sense of purpose, even amid unimaginable suffering, survived at substantially higher rates than those who lost their why. Your retirement years operate on precisely the same principle. Without purpose, without meaning, without a reason to rise each morning, your mind begins to deteriorate long before your body. What's happening psychologically is that your identity, the very structure of your self-concept, has likely been excessively tied to your occupational role. When that role vanishes, the psyche experiences something akin to an amputation. The question becomes not, what will I do, but the far more profound, who am I now? This identity crisis doesn't resolve itself through golf or cruises. It demands a fundamental reimagining of your purpose on this earth. The transformation begins with a seemingly simple but profoundly difficult question: what suffering in the world am I uniquely positioned to alleviate? Not what would be fun or what would pass the time, but what meaningful contribution remains undone that you, with your particular skills, experiences, and wisdom, could address. The answer rarely lies in leisure. It lies in service, in contribution, in leaving a world slightly better than you found it. Start small. Identify one specific area where your accumulated wisdom could genuinely benefit others. Perhaps mentoring young people in your former profession, perhaps addressing a community need that's been overlooked. The specific domain matters less than the genuine contribution. Make a commitment to dedicate 3 hours weekly, not to distraction but to meaningful service in this area. This isn't about filling time, it's about creating value. The psychological transformation that occurs when you shift from consumer to contributor is nothing short of remarkable. The biochemical cascade of purpose, the release of neurotransmitters associated with meaning and satisfaction, creates a positive feedback loop that quite literally rejuvenates both mind and body. You aren't just helping others, you're biochemically rebuilding yourself. What's truly at stake here is nothing less than your dignity in these final decades. A man without purpose becomes increasingly self-absorbed, increasingly bitter, increasingly trapped in cycles of meaningless consumption and entertainment that never truly satisfy. The alternative, a life organized around meaningful contribution, offers not just satisfaction, but a profound sense of continuity with your earlier life. Not an ending, but a transformation. You have a profound responsibility to reject society's narrative about retirement as an ending. To recognize that your accumulated wisdom, properly directed, represents an invaluable resource in a world desperately in need of exactly what you possess. This isn't about ego or legacy. It's about the fundamental human need to matter, to contribute, to leave a small corner of existence better for your having been here. Now let's talk about something equally critical, the absolute necessity of maintaining rigorous daily structure after retirement. Let me tell you something about time after retirement that most men completely misunderstand. The freedom from structured workdays, which seemed so appealing during your career, becomes a treacherous psychological territory when mishandled. Unstructured time doesn't liberate you, it disorients you. It doesn't expand your possibilities, it shrinks your world to the confines of your living room. I witnessed my colleague, brilliant surgeon, disciplined his entire life, gradually deteriorate after retirement because he abandoned all semblance of structure. His days became formless, sleep patterns erratic, meals irregular, physical activity sporadic. Within 18 months, his cognitive sharpness noticeably declined, his physical vitality diminished, not because of age, but because the fundamental architecture supporting healthy human functioning, daily structure, had collapsed. This represents one of Jung's most profound insights, that humans require a balance between freedom and constraint. Pure freedom, untethered from structure, doesn't lead to liberation but to chaos. And chaos, psychologically speaking, creates a state of perpetual low-grade distress that accelerates aging at the cellular level. Your nervous system evolved under conditions of predictable rhythms, of light and dark, activity and rest, exertion and recovery. When those rhythms disappear, your entire biological system becomes dysregulated. What's happening psychologically is a collapse of what behavioral scientists call environmental scaffolding, the external structures that support internal regulation. During your career, external demands created this scaffolding automatically. Now you must create it consciously, deliberately, through daily discipline. This isn't about nostalgia for work. It's about recognizing that human flourishing requires rhythmic structure regardless of employment status. Begin by establishing 3 non-negotiable anchors in your daily schedule: wake time, meal times, and sleep time. Not occasionally, but with religious consistency. Then add 1 physical activity scheduled at the same time daily, perhaps a morning walk or afternoon strength training. The specific activity matters less than the rhythmic consistency. Your body craves these predictable patterns. They signal to your entire system that order still prevails. The psychological and physiological benefits of maintaining this strict daily structure are profound. Cognitive function improves, mood stabilizes, sleep quality deepens. But perhaps most importantly, this structure creates the necessary foundation for meaningfully engaging with the world beyond your home. Structure doesn't confine your freedom. It creates the stable platform from which genuine freedom becomes possible. What's truly at stake here is not just your health, but your continued engagement with life itself. Without structure, your world progressively shrinks. Your reference points become increasingly domestic and trivial. Your mental horizons contract until your entire existence revolves around home maintenance, television schedules, and medical appointments. The antidote isn't merely activity, it's structured activity that connects you to something larger than yourself. You have a profound moral obligation to maintain rigorous structure, not just for yourself, but for those who care about you. Every man who surrenders to formlessness after retirement becomes eventually a burden to others, not because of age itself, but because the absence of structure accelerates every negative aspect of aging. The choice to maintain disciplined daily rhythms is not merely personal preference, it's a responsibility you bear to everyone who depends on your continued vitality. Now let's examine something equally essential: the absolute necessity of physical movement, not just for physical health, but for cognitive resilience and emotional stability. I've worked with countless men who completely misunderstand the role of physical activity in later life. They treat it as optional, as recreational, or worse, as something they've earned the right to abandon. This catastrophic misunderstanding accelerates cognitive decline more than almost any other factor. My friend Richard, philosophy professor, intellectually brilliant throughout his career, began experiencing alarming memory issues within 2 years of retirement, not because of inherent neurological problems, but because he'd abandoned the daily campus walks that had been part of his routine for decades. When he reinstated rigorous daily movement, just 30 minutes of brisk walking each morning, his cognitive function noticeably improved within weeks. This wasn't coincidence, it was causation through well-documented neurological pathways. Physical movement, particularly activities that combine cardiovascular exertion with balance and coordination, directly impacts brain structure. It increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein essential for creating new neural connections. It improves cerebral blood flow, delivering oxygen and nutrients to brain tissue. And perhaps most critically for men over 65, it helps regulate stress hormones that, when chronically elevated, directly damage the hippocampus, the brain region essential for forming new memories. Let me tell you something that most conventional wisdom about aging gets catastrophically wrong: the relationship between learning and brain function after 65. The prevailing narrative suggests your brain has limited capacity for new learning in later years, that cognitive decline is inevitable, that you should focus on preserving what you have rather than expanding your intellectual horizons. This represents a profound misunderstanding of neuroscience that's destroying the cognitive potential of millions of men. I witnessed my mentor, distinguished professor, intellectually formidable throughout his career, actually enhance his cognitive function in his 70s and 80s, not by doing crossword puzzles or brain games, but by learning Japanese, an entirely new language with unfamiliar characters and linguistic structures. The deliberate embrace of difficult learning, not passive entertainment masquerading as mental stimulation, transformed his neural architecture and kept his mind exceptionally sharp until his final days. This represents one of the most well-established principles in neuroplasticity research, that the brain continues to form new neural connections throughout life when challenged with novel, complex learning. What deteriorates in aging isn't the capacity to learn, but the willingness to endure the discomfort of beginning again. As a novice, pride becomes the enemy of neural growth. The need to appear competent prevents the very vulnerability that stimulates cognitive rejuvenation. What's happening psychologically is that many men develop what psychologists call cognitive entrenchment, deepening existing neural pathways rather than creating new ones. They revisit familiar intellectual territory rather than exploring new domains. They consume information that confirms existing views rather than challenges them. This intellectual comfort accelerates neural atrophy far more rapidly than the natural aging process. Begin by selecting one entirely unfamiliar domain of knowledge or skill, perhaps a musical instrument, a language, a craft, or an academic subject outside your previous expertise. Commit to deliberate, structured learning in this domain for 30–45 minutes daily. Not passive consumption, but active engagement that includes practice, feedback, and measurable progress. The specific domain matters less than its novelty and complexity. The psychological and neurological benefits of this deliberate learning extend far beyond the specific skill acquired. You're not just learning Spanish or woodworking, you're fundamentally restructuring your neural architecture. You're creating cognitive reserve that protects against dementia. You're generating precisely the neurochemical environment that maintains cognitive resilience. And perhaps most importantly, you're preserving the essential human quality of wonder, the capacity to be amazed by new discovery. What's truly at stake here extends far beyond cognitive function. It's about how you experience the remaining time allotted to you. Will these years be characterized by intellectual retreat, by an increasingly narrow band of interests and perspectives, or will they involve continued discovery, expansion, and the particular joy that comes from developing new capabilities? The difference often comes down to your willingness to embrace the discomfort of novice status after decades of competence. The responsibility falls on you to reject the cultural narrative about cognitive decline as inevitable, to recognize that while certain neural processes naturally slow with age, the capacity for new learning, for neural growth and adaptation, remains intact throughout life when properly stimulated. This isn't merely about self-improvement, it's about manifesting the fullest expression of your humanity until your final days. Now let's talk about something equally essential for men over 65, the creation of legacy that transcends your individual existence. Most men fundamentally misunderstand the psychological importance of legacy work in later years. They confuse it with ego gratification or name recognition. But true legacy work serves a far more profound psychological function. It connects you to something that will continue beyond your individual lifespan. My colleague, successful entrepreneur, financially secure, found himself increasingly anxious about mortality despite his material success. Not until he established a mentoring program for disadvantaged youth in his industry did this existential anxiety begin to subside. Not because it distracted him from death, but because it connected him to something that would outlive him. This wasn't coincidence. It was addressing a fundamental psychological need that intensifies as we age. This represents what developmental psychologists call generativity. Erik Erikson's term for the stage of life concerned with creating and nurturing things that will outlast the self. This isn't mere sentimentality. It's a psychological imperative that when neglected, manifests as depression, anxiety, and a painful sense of life's ultimate meaninglessness. Your psyche demands connection to a future it knows you won't personally witness. What's happening psychologically is the natural shift from what Jung called the first half of life concerns establishing identity, achieving competence, to second half of life concerns finding meaning, creating legacy. This shift isn't optional, it's developmentally necessary. Resisting it doesn't preserve youth. It creates a state of developmental arrest that manifests as increasing bitterness and existential despair. Let me tell you about something most men completely misunderstand about aging: the relationship between emotional regulation and cognitive function after 65. The conventional wisdom suggests that emotional volatility increases naturally with age, that you're entitled to greater irritability, entitled to less patience, entitled to more frequent outbursts. This represents a catastrophic misunderstanding of the aging brain that accelerates cognitive decline more dramatically than almost any other factor. I witnessed my colleague, distinguished business leader, emotionally balanced throughout his career, gradually surrender to emotional reactivity after retirement. Small frustrations triggered disproportionate anger. Minor disappointments spiraled into prolonged despair. This wasn't an inevitable consequence of aging. It was the atrophy of emotional regulation skills that had previously been maintained through professional necessity. The consequences were profound: relationships damaged, opportunities lost, and his subjective experience of life significantly diminished. This represents one of the most well-established principles in neuropsychology, that emotional regulation and cognitive function are inextricably linked in the aging brain. The prefrontal cortex regions responsible for dampening limbic system reactivity are precisely the same regions essential for memory, decision-making, and executive function. When you surrender to emotional volatility, you're not just becoming cranky, you're actively accelerating cognitive deterioration. What's happening psychologically is the weakening of what neuroscientists call cognitive inhibition, the ability to suppress automatic emotional responses in favor of more measured reactions. Without the external constraints of professional environments, many men gradually lose this essential capacity. The limbic system, your emotional brain, begins to dominate the prefrontal systems responsible for regulation. This doesn't just feel unpleasant, it fundamentally reshapes your brain structure. Begin by establishing one simple but powerful practice: the deliberate pause. When you feel emotional reactivity arising, physically pause. Take one conscious breath before responding. This isn't about suppression, but about creating space between stimulus and response. Start with minor irritations, and gradually extend this practice to more significant emotional triggers. The consistency matters more than duration. The psychological and neurological benefits of maintaining strict emotional regulation extend far beyond improved relationships. You're not just becoming more pleasant company, you're actively strengthening the neural networks essential for cognitive resilience. You're preserving executive function. You're maintaining the precise brain regions most vulnerable to age-related decline. And perhaps most importantly, you're reclaiming authority over your internal experience rather than being hijacked by it. What's truly at stake here extends beyond your own emotional experience. It's about the legacy of interaction you leave with everyone you encounter. Will your final years be characterized by increasing bitterness, by hair-trigger reactions that drive others away? Or will they involve the particular wisdom that comes from emotional mastery, the capacity to respond rather than react, to understand rather than judge? This distinction shapes not just your experience, but the willingness of others to remain connected to you. Now let's examine something equally essential yet widely misunderstood: the transformative power of disciplined gratitude practice in later life. Not the superficial count your blessings platitudes, but a rigorous psychological intervention that fundamentally alters your perception of reality. I've worked with countless men who dismissed gratitude as sentimental nonsense, only to discover it represents one of the most powerful cognitive reframing tools available to the aging brain. My friend Thomas, hardened Vietnam veteran psychologically scarred from both war and a difficult childhood, transformed his final years through methodical gratitude practice. Not occasional warm feelings, but deliberate daily identification of specific concrete experiences worthy of appreciation. The progressive shift in his perception was remarkable. not because his circumstances changed, but because the lens through which he viewed those circumstances fundamentally transformed. This represents what psychologists call attentional bias modification, the deliberate reshaping of what you notice and emphasize in your daily experience. Your brain has limited attentional capacity. What you repeatedly focus on literally reshapes your neural architecture. A brain trained in negativity bias becomes increasingly efficient at spotting problems, slights, and disappointments. A brain trained in appreciation becomes increasingly attuned to meaning, beauty, and connection. Let me tell you something most men completely misunderstand about confronting mortality. The conventional wisdom suggests that peace comes through distraction, keeping so busy you never have to think about death. That acceptance means resignation, that the topic itself is somehow morbid or depressing. This represents a catastrophic misunderstanding of human psychology that robs your final decades of their potential depth and meaning. I witnessed my friend, a celebrated surgeon, materially successful, perpetually distracted, live in constant low-grade anxiety precisely because he refused to confront his finitude directly. Not until he faced his mortality, not abstractly but concretely, did he experience the profound psychological liberation that transformed his remaining years. The paradox was striking. His deliberate confrontation with death didn't diminish his joy. It dramatically intensified it. This represents one of the most profound insights from existential psychology, that authentic living becomes possible only when we integrate the reality of our mortality into consciousness, not as a morbid obsession but as the fundamental context that gives life its urgency and meaning. What makes human consciousness unique is precisely our awareness of our finite nature. And what makes life meaningful is how we respond to that awareness. What's happening psychologically when you avoid confronting mortality is a form of existential inauthenticity that manifests as perpetual underlying anxiety. Your deeper self knows what your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. This dissonance creates a shadow that follows you, diminishing your capacity for presence and joy, not because you're thinking about death, but because you're expending enormous psychological energy avoiding thinking about it. Begin with a simple but profound practice. Spend 10 minutes weekly in deliberate contemplation of your finite nature, not morbidly, but with genuine curiosity. Consider what truly matters in light of limited time. What would you do differently if you had 5 more years? 1 more year? How would your priorities shift? What would fall away as unimportant? Document these reflections in a journal dedicated to this purpose. The psychological transformation that occurs through this practice is nothing short of remarkable. Petty concerns diminish. Authentic priorities clarify. Tolerance for meaningless social posturing evaporates. You begin experiencing what psychologists call mortality salience benefits, the heightened appreciation for everyday experiences, deeper capacity for intimacy, and expanded perspective that comes from living in conscious relationship with finitude. What's truly at stake here is nothing less than the depth and authenticity of your remaining time. Will you live these final chapters in perpetual low-grade anxiety, constantly distracting yourself from the inevitable? Or will you allow the awareness of limited time to burn away everything inessential, leaving only what truly matters? This distinction determines whether your final years are merely endured or genuinely inhabited. Now let's address the final and perhaps most profound dimension of successful aging: transcending self-absorption to connect with something larger than your individual existence. Most men fundamentally misunderstand the psychological importance of transcendent perspective in later years. They remain trapped in narratives centered on personal achievement, personal comfort, personal status, precisely when developmental wisdom calls for expanding beyond the boundaries of self. My mentor, renowned academic defined by intellectual achievement throughout his career, found himself increasingly depressed despite his accomplishments. Not until he shifted his focus from personal legacy to participation in the ongoing human project of knowledge building did his depression lift, not because he became distracted from his problems, but because he expanded his identity beyond the boundaries of his individual lifespan. This wasn't coincidence. It was addressing a fundamental psychological need that intensifies as we age. This represents what transpersonal psychologists call self-transcendence, the capacity to identify with something that extends beyond your individual existence. This isn't mystical nonsense. It's a psychological imperative that becomes increasingly urgent in later life. Your psyche intuitively recognizes that exclusive identification with your separate self becomes increasingly problematic as that self approaches its inevitable end. What's happening psychologically is the natural culmination of healthy human development, the expansion from egocentric to transcendent awareness. This shift isn't optional. It's the final developmental task of a well-lived life. Resisting it doesn't preserve individuality. It creates a state of psychological constriction that manifests as increasing self-absorption, bitterness, and fear. The transcendent perspective isn't about abandoning your individuality, but about recognizing your participation in something larger: natural systems, cultural heritage, spiritual traditions, future generations, or the ongoing human project. This expanded identity doesn't diminish your uniqueness, it contextualizes it within a larger whole that will continue beyond your individual lifespan. What's truly at stake here is how you experience your final years. Will they be characterized by increasing psychological constriction, by desperate attempts to preserve a separate self that you intuitively know is temporary? Or will they involve the particular wisdom that comes from expanded identity, the capacity to find meaning in participation rather than domination, in contribution rather than accumulation? This distinction determines whether aging becomes a process of diminishment or expansion. You have a profound responsibility to recognize that transcending exclusive identification with your separate self isn't surrender. It's the fulfillment of your humanity. This isn't about legacy in the ego sense. It's about experiencing your fundamental connectedness to a reality larger than yourself, while you still inhabit this remarkable consciousness you've been granted. The difference between aging and growing old isn't semantic, it's existential. Aging is biological inevitability. Growing old is psychological surrender. The chaos of passive aging manifests as purposelessness, irrelevance, and the quiet desperation of unfulfilled potential, while the ordered response, purpose, structure, learning, emotional mastery, creates not merely extended existence but expanded consciousness. Ask yourself this: will your remaining years be defined by what you're leaving behind or by what you're still becoming? The choice between diminishment and transfiguration remains perpetually yours to make, not once but daily, in how you meet each dawn you're granted.